Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Brendan Cole. June the 12th is Russia Day. It's a holiday that was set up in 1992 as a declaration of sovereignty in the wake of the end of communism. The day is marked by concerts, celebrations, and a fair degree of pageantry. And this year's 20th anniversary of Russia Day has also provided a platform for the country's protest movement, which has been gathering in public with greater frequency and in greater numbers since parliamentary elections last December in Russia sparked allegations of fraud. Tuesday's protest has been dubbed the March of the Millions. People took to the centre of Moscow to protest against the rule of President Vladimir Putin. And the movement has been riled about something else. For a bill has just been signed into law that dramatically raises fines for people involved in unauthorised rallies. Organisers of illegal protests now face up fines of up to $30,000. It all comes in the wake of events of May the 6th, when over 400 people were arrested and scores injured as a rally against Putin's rule turned violent when protesters briefly broke through police lines. President Putin and Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev say the bill is aimed at maintaining public order and will bring Russia in line with other countries, while opponents cite it as part of a clampdown on the rights of protesters. So which is it? To discuss this issue, I'm joined in the studio by the former Kremlin advisor, Aleksandr Nekrassov. Also in the studio is the lawyer Dr. Abhijit Pandya from the Centre for Democratic Studies. On the line, I'm joined by Alex Pravda. He's a fellow at the Russian and Eurasian Studies Centre at St. Antony's College, Oxford University, and Elena Bezrodnova in Moscow, who's a specialist in information law. Starting with the protest bill, Aleksandr Nekrassov, the bill that was passed last week, what do you think about it?
Well, I think that was a mistake, to be honest. I think it's too harsh. I think that the advisors in the Kremlin are not really giving the proper advice to President Putin. I think that restricting any showings of public discontent doesn't really result in providing public order. And actually you can see across Europe at the moment where I think the authorities are clamping down quite hard on demonstrators. If we see Greece, and even if we look at the student protests in Britain, by the way, I thought it was quite rough. So what it does is it pushes the public discontent underground, and then it creates even more problems. I think it's too harsh.
Abhijit Pandya from the Centre for Democratic Studies, what do you think? Do you think this measure is a curbing of freedom of expression, or should the right to protest be absolute?
No, the right of protest cannot be absolute. You have to have the safeguards of those who are protesting in mind. You have to have the safeguards of the police in mind, who are also men with families. You've got to remember this law. All this law does is it says that if you organise a rally, you've got to ensure that you've told the authorities and got permission. Now, that's happened in the United Kingdom since 1986. And the reason that happens is so that violent people don't put other people's lives at risk. And for that law to be effective, it may be necessary to have a large fine to do so. So I think what this law does is, in fact, protect those who want to protest peacefully, who want to make sure their messages put out there without their message being clouded by other people who want to commit violence and turn legitimate political exercise through protest into a form of criminality where people are committing criminal damage and assault on others. So I think, in fact, that all the law does is, in fact, protect those who are trying to get their message across. And, in fact, it allows that to occur more effectively by removing the troublemakers and ensuring that those who have sought permission can get permission legitimately and exercise a right freely without being interfered with by violent people who wish to should just be there for other purposes rather than protesting.
Elena Bezrodnova in Moscow, what about the passage of this law? What do you think about the passage of this law? Was it done too quickly?
Yeah, actually, it's the exact point of view I share, because I think, first of all, this bill and this law adopted is aimed at protecting protests. And first of all, I do not think that it's too harsh, because, in my opinion, it's in complete correspondence with the worldwide practice. Because if you speak about the amount of the fines and also about some special measures with some special restrictions put on protests, I think it's quite normal and in correspondence with the worldwide practice.
Alex Pravda at St. Antony's College in Oxford, the fines for protesting in unsanctioned rallies in Switzerland, for instance, are $100,000. In Germany, it's €15,000. There's nothing particularly unusual about a high fine in Russia if you attend an unsanctioned rally. What do you make of it?
What I make of it is this. I mean, it is, and I agree with the comments, the first comment, it's an overreaction by the Kremlin to repeated momentum of protest. It's a measure which is meant to intimidate protesters And I think it's going to be counterproductive, because the major reason why we've had so many protests in Russia is people objecting to how arrogantly the government treats civil society. So this is another bit of evidence for that. Secondly, the comparison with European countries on paper looks all right, but it's a very big but. If there is widespread confidence in the objective nature of the court and the legal process, and I don't think anyone would claim in Russia that there is a universal sort of confidence in the independence of the courts of political authorities. So putting this law into operation is going to involve a lot of political prejudice, and many people also say it's really unenforceable. I mean, how are you going to actually apply these fines and impose them? So it's a blanket kind of overreaction measure to discourage people from joining in protests. I don't think it's going to do that, and it's going to set up a whole lot of other problems and probably be counterproductive in the long run.
Abhijit Pandya, is there any kind of precedent in other European countries for a law like this to be passed so quickly?
I think that the first role of a government must be to secure its citizens when they're taking part in genuine civil society activities like protesting. So when marches go beyond that into violence, as we saw in the United Kingdom and with the miners and those people who were laid off by the Thatcher government, when those protests turn into attacking the police, throwing bottles, throwing petrol bombs and the rest, the first duty of the government must be to protect those carrying out a democratic right of protest. So imposing a fine quickly, rapidly, ensures that basically law and order is kept. As Thomas Paine, the historical great civil libertarian activist, said that it's better to have some government enforced than complete anarchy and maintain the rule of law, because overall it protects more right that it diminishes. And I think that's here. There's a very fine balance being made between. No one in Russia is prohibiting people from protesting. What they're saying is, if you want to protest, we want to know who's accountable for that. We want to know the names of people who are organising it. So if things do go awry, then we can step in and actually hold people to account. And I think that is effective law and order, and that, in fact, on the long run, protects the right to protest. I mean, now in the United Kingdom, if anybody wants to protest against Mugabe or another regime, there's a freedom to protest outside the embassy because the police know who is organising it. If things go wrong, that permission has been sought in advance, and that's why we have such a proliferation of peaceful protesting, which is a form of legitimate political activism. So, in fact, I think in the long run, what may happen in Russia is that the protests will proliferate because the government has allowed safety and law and order to be maintained through ensuring that those who are maybe responsible for sort of violent, anarchic, dangerous marches to be held into account. Now, of course, this is a matter for how criminal discretion is exercised when you're, firstly, seeking permission. Is permission going to be unjustly removed from those seeking to march? Well, that's a matter of having the appropriate judicial process in place to challenge a denial of the right, granting of the right. And secondly, how is the prosecution of those who are organising marches taking place? Now, those two things, of course, are in limbo in the air. We don't know that yet. But it would be wrong to prejudicially attack the Russian government at the moment, who are carrying out a legitimate exercise of controlling peace and order and protecting that important right of peaceful protest.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're talking about the protest movement in Russia, and joining me is the former Kremlin advisor Aleksandr Nekrassov, the lawyer Dr. Abhijit Pandya from the Centre for Democratic Studies. On the line is Alex Pravda from St. Antony's College, Oxford University, and the Moscow lawyer Elena Bezrodnova. Aleksandr Nekrassov, the protests on May the 6th turned violent, yet a permit was still granted for this protest in June. So people still have the right to protest.
Well, nobody is saying that there shouldn't be rights of protesters safeguarded in Russia, and I think it's the police is doing that. What we are missing here, the point is this. Usually the violent elements are very few in every demonstration. And when we say that by imposing huge fines, and for Russia, the fines that are mentioned here are quite tough. And when we talk about protecting sort of the majority from the minority, I don't think that's the case here, because we're basically imposing a certain sort of frightening sort of element on the majority rather than on this minority. This minority doesn't care, by the way, about the fines, about anything. They don't care about permissions. They will always be violent, and that's the problem. Also, the heavy-handedness of the police. Now, that is another matter we need to remember. I don't think the Russian police is the only one who is guilty of that. I think that we have seen some of really heavy-handed tactics, even in Britain, in the country much. I remember when the police just went berserk. And unfortunately, when the police use heavy-handed tactics and sometimes even provoke violence, nobody usually goes to court. Nobody gets punished. Now, I would like to know whether that law specifically says that if the police is guilty of provoking violence, what will happen then?
Elena Bezrodnova, I'll turn to you in Moscow. If the police get heavy-handed, is there any recourse for the protesters?
Yes, of course. It is an article in the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation just forbidding police officers to commit offences during their service. And actually, the protesters who suffered some damage from the actions of the police could file a criminal claim with the court and seek some recovery of this damage. However, as my colleague previously mentioned, it is very hard to prove these damages to the court, and sometimes it's almost impossible.
So in practice, it doesn't make any difference at all, does it? In practice, the police can operate with impunity. Is that what you're saying?
Not exactly, because just I want to mention that if we speak about protests which were held this year just after the presidential elections, I think it's the protestants to be blamed because of the violence which took place during this protest. Because it's not only the police officers who were provoking people on the streets. It were also the protestants who threw stones at the police officers. So I think it's just the situation where two parties were to blame.
Alex Pravda at Oxford University. The day before the protests on Russia Day, the homes of two prominent opposition figures were raided. Alexei Navalny, who's an anti-corruption blogger, also the leader of the Left Front, Sergei Udaltsov, they were searched by police. This whole debate, this whole argument is actually playing into their hands, isn't it? Because this is making headlines right across the West, and they're becoming champions, effectively, of free speech, aren't they?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think the key to the whole thing is, we've discussed this, is the disproportionality of the law, of the fines. They're out of all proportion to the problems that have actually developed. There's been very little violence, very little in the way of any kind of rioting. And think of this in terms of the Russian context. The average annual income is something like $8,000. So the top fines are more than 1 year's average income for somebody. So this is right out of all proportion. And even the Presidential Human Rights Council have objected to this law. So it's not really in line with normal practice in that sense. Coming back to your point that this is actually going to publicize the protests much more internationally and even domestically than anything else. I think that's absolutely right.
The March of the Millions, and quite clearly there's not going to be anywhere near that. There's, I think the permit allowed 50,000 people to attend. It might be in the tens of thousands. But if you compare it to protests in other parts of Europe, say in Greece, where you have hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions, is there something in the Russian psyche that makes them less likely to take to the street?
Well, I think that, first of all, the March of the Millions is a symbolic name, obviously. Nobody was expecting millions to come.
Obviously, but more than 50,000 would be anticipated.
But obviously the opposition in Russia is fragmented. It's not organized. I don't really see any charismatic figures who can unite many people around them. If we talk about the ones whose flats and houses were searched yesterday, I don't really see anybody there who could excite hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, we're talking about Ksenia Sobchak, a Paris Hilton type of figure. How is she an opposition figure? I don't understand.
She's a television
television
talk
presenter
show host.
And a sort of a celebrity. Udaltsov, the one who was mentioned, I don't really see him again as a sort of a charismatic figure who can unite many people around him. There is nobody there, basically. And another problem with the Russian opposition is that it doesn't really offer anything. That's the problem, because it has to have a program. It has to basically suggest something different from what this government, from its current government's policies, from Putin's policies, and it's got nothing to offer. So that, I think, is a problem. I think that is not the fault of the opposition. When I was in the Kremlin, I was suggesting that President Yeltsin allows other political forces to develop, to grow, to build these political democratic institutions. Well, it didn't happen. And unfortunately, we'll probably see for another decade or so this sort of disruption rather than opposition.
From a legal standpoint, Abhijit Pandya, do these sorts of bills, do they tend to get amendments and they change over time? Do you see, say, with this Russian bill, that's it, it's in stone, everybody's got to abide by it?
That goes on depending on if new situations turn up which require further control or less control, for that matter. But there's something underlying this discussion which is a little bit concerning to me, which is that what is the right to protest? It is not a right to change a government. That is done through the ballot box. The right to protest is to show that you're unhappy with something in a way which is civilized, in a way which does not put other people's lives at risk. It is a right of expression, but a much more restricted one, because simply you are in close proximity with other people. Now, this right of simply standing up and putting up placards has led itself into legislation across Europe fundamentally because people are not able to abide by the rules. And it's no surprises then that state authorities have to protect other people, including property as well, by coming up with legislative means. When you hear the way that people talk about it, it's as if there is an unlimited right to do whatever you want. And that cannot be the case. If you want to have real political change, you have to set up a political party or vote or go to the ballot box. You don't do that through turning a protest into something which might sway people's mind. It's a protest. You're standing up and saying, I don't agree with something. I'll
turn to you, Elena Bezrodnova. You're a lawyer in Moscow. Amongst the legal fraternity, how is this bill being viewed? And do you anticipate in the months to come, these fines are very punitive, but in practice, will there be 300,000 ruble fines, 1 million ruble fines, or is it just simply a measure that's designed to scare people?
It's a measure to restrict people, because it's very unlikely that the courts in Russia will impose such strict liability on persons involved with the process. Because as we now see in the Administrative Violations Code of the Russian Federation, we have a gap between the sum of the fines. So actually I think that ordinary people involved with the process are very unlikely to be fined with such a great sums of money. And to speak about organizers of the protest movements in Russia, actually, I think there will be fines, and with some strict fines, actually. And if we speak about this federal law, which amended the Administrative Violations Code, as we can see now, there will be some new kind of punishment in it, so-called compulsory community service. And also, I think that for organizers of the protest movements in Russia, the compulsory community service will be the most likely punishment imposed by the court.
Alex Pravda at Oxford University. Aleksandr Nekrassov was speaking earlier just about the lack of opposition figures that the country can get behind. They don't have a unified message. I mean, surely the protest movement can't continue this impetus when it doesn't have a unified message and anybody can really rally behind.
Well, you see, what surprised everybody is that with all the fragmentation of the protest movement, which is absolutely right, they haven't got a good institutionalized leadership. The depth of discontent seems to be sufficient to keep the momentum going beyond anything anyone would have predicted a year ago. The right of protest is not absolute, and of course it's not designed to change politics, but the degree to which there are protests in any country is an indication of the failings of the political system. And I think this is what's worrying the Kremlin and the authorities, that the repetition of protests on the streets in Moscow, and indeed in some regional cities as well, reflects very badly on the actual institutions that exist, political parties and groups and so on. So civil society is doing it in its own spontaneous way, and just putting up deterrence to this and imposing sanctions isn't going to resolve the nub of the matter, which is discontent, which is widespread. I think the only way forward, actually, is to try to get the fragmentation to some degree of organization and to get a response from the authorities is a kind of approach that Kudrin, the former Minister of Finance, has suggested, that there is an institutionalized dialogue, some sort of almost round table at which the protesters are encouraged to put forward coherent demands beyond something which we now have a Manifesto Free Russia, which is a kind of assortment of demands, including things about forestry, environment, Putin, and so on, and that there could be a program and there could be a dialogue. But so far, there's not been a successful move in that direction.
Aleksandr Nekrassov, do you think that dialogue is possible?
Well, at the moment, as I said, it's very difficult to imagine a dialogue because of the fragmentation, and there is no single voice, or even there's so many of people demanding something that nobody really understands what they're looking for. But I actually disagree with that point that a protest is just you walk out on the street and say something and then go back home and that's it. No, that doesn't work like that. That's not a protest. That's just wasting your time. I think that a protest needs to alert parts of the political establishment to the trouble, to the problems in the country. And the only way you can alert them is by first figures. That means coming out, in thousands and hundreds of thousands of people. That alerts the establishment. If a few people come out with placards, nobody will pay attention. So in this respect, this new law, I think, it comes at a bad time and in a very hasty manner, especially if we go back and look at the massive demonstrations before the presidential elections. There was no violence, none at all. So why this haste? I think the presentation, once again, the Kremlin failed in the presentation. I think their PR, when it comes to this particular case, is a disaster.
Back to you, Alex Pravda from Oxford University. It's a PR disaster. It could have been handled better, doesn't it?
I think it's the Kremlin which has clearly imposed this law on the political elite establishment. Look, at the first time for years the Duma actually acted like a parliament. There were 400 amendments, 147 votes against. There was a filibuster for 12 hours. This wasn't a well-judged political move. It was sprung upon the Duma and forced through. And as you said, in terms of national and international public opinion, it is a disaster because it points up the kind of drift of the Putin regime to what some people have started to talk about Belarus, have started to talk about a police state. So running ahead of this publicity is a very bad image, and I think it's going to be counterproductive all around.
And do you think it suggests that they're afraid of an Arab Spring here, or is that because those are the comparisons that the Western media seem to be drawing, rightly or wrongly?
I think that there's no comparison between what's happening in Russia and the Arab awakening, but there is a different political atmosphere now where civil society has had the confidence, or sufficient confidence, of tens of thousands, 50,000 people to take to the streets. 7% now, even although it was 11% a year ago, say they're willing to join the protest. So there's a new habit, a new kind of political environment, I think, in Russia, which is not going to go away and certainly will not be reduced. It was likely to be induced by this kind of overreaction and sanctions and punitive fines.
Abhijit Pandya, there have been protests on the 31st of each month for the last 2 or 3 years. It's known as the Strategy 31 group. They meet on the 31st of each month to protest the 31st article of the Russian Constitution, which gives them the right to gather freely. Each month they've been broken up. Each month key Russian opposition figures such as Boris Nemtsov get arrested. It makes headlines. But these kinds of gatherings only have 1,000 or 2,000 people. Do these smaller gatherings have the capacity to make more of an impact than, say, a big widespread protest? What do you think?
I think that's empirical guesswork, which I wouldn't be able to go into. I don't have a crystal ball to know what impact it has on a politician subjectively, the size of a group. What I would say is it doesn't matter if 20 people are getting together or 10,000 people. You have to have the same law that protects those people who are getting together. I've heard a lot of strange things during this discussion. I've heard, Alex in St. Anthony saying that it's a disproportionate measure, it's sanctions or whatever. Hang on, we don't know what is disproportionate because we don't know whether it's effective. If this law reduces violence, it allows protests to proliferate, then it's a successful measure, and that has to be seen with time as time goes on. We can't sit here and pretend to double guess whether it's appropriate or not. Of course, one can string together various things that the government might be doing: arrests here, controlling protests there, and put up an image of, some sort of, as if we're back in the 1940s in Russia and the like. But I think that would be going into the realms of fiction, or certainly into the realms of unempirical concatenation of facts. I'd rather look at it objectively and say that a legitimate response by a government to violent protests is to reduce them, to protect the lives of protesters and to protect the right. And that is exactly what the government has done so far. And anything else, without looking at how denial of rights of protest are given, and without looking at how prosecutions are to occur in the future and what remedies will be available and how those remedies are used, is simply guesswork as to whether the right has diminished or not.
You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. Aleksandr Nekrassov, former Kremlin advisor. This month, Prokhorov set up another party, the Civil Platform Party. He got 6 million votes at the last election. Do you think, in terms of the protest movement more broadly, the opposition in Russia, do you think somebody like him could be a genuine contender?
Well, I think, first of all, that Prokhorov has no chance. because in many Russian eyes, he's associated with this group of oligarchs who have enriched themselves beyond all belief, and he's not trusted. What he could have done is he could use his money to fund a proper political party and to start developing in a proper way. But I don't think he himself has any chance at all.
Alex Pravda from Oxford University, what do you think about the contenders such as Prokhorov? And obviously, if there's going to be any strong kind of opposition movement, it requires contenders that people can get behind.
No, I don't think he is, because he does belong to the millionaire class. His idea of his new party is very curious. It's going to be limited to 500 people. It won't have any leaders or any ideology. I don't think this will be a popular party. But to return to our early discussion, there's no charismatic leader. Udaltsov is a good orator. What you usually get in history is these sort of movements, as they develop, produce charismatic leaders. So I wouldn't be surprised if with another year or so of demonstrations and fragmentation on the streets and in the Duma, we will get a charismatic leader. And sadly, I think it's likely to more come from the nationalist side of the political spectrum than from the liberal one.
Aleksandr Nekrassov, somebody like Yeltsin, thrived in a crisis. He didn't mind a bit of uncertainty. Putin, with his measure last week, he needs certainty, doesn't he? And this kind of legislation shows that, doesn't it?
Well, I think that what it shows is that Putin is being ill-advised. This is a very, very important situation here. I think that the security services are having way too much power and way too much influence on the president. I think he has some of the advisors who are saying, let's be very cautious, let's tighten security, let's tighten the regulations and laws. I think it's time for Putin to relax, to be honest, and become sort of laid back and be flexible and use methods which are more acceptable in the civilized world. What we're talking about here is that, okay, maybe this law will be changed, because Putin did mention that there might be changes made to this law. But we're talking about the background, and the background is telling us that this is not the correct way of doing this. Maybe the law will be changed, but PR-wise, it was a disaster.
Moscow and St. Petersburg, the bulk of protests will take place there, or is this something that will spread right across Russia? What do you think?
Well, I think that most of the protests will continue to take place in Moscow and Russia, simply because the opposition does not really have any popular support across the country. If you go to the regions, you will find very few people who support the likes of Udaltsov, Navalny or Nemtsov. And that's why they basically stick to the capitals rather than go to the country. I think that this sort of standoff situation will continue for a while, but we can never. I think it's completely wrong to think that we are seeing the signs of some Arab Spring or some mass sort of movement against the government. Putin still commands quite substantial support in the regions across the country, and let's not forget about this.
I'd like to end now by thanking all my guests. That's Dr. Abhijit Pandya from the Centre for Democratic Studies, former Kremlin advisor Aleksandr Nekrassov, Alex Pravda from St. Anthony's College in Oxford, and Elena Bezrodnova in Moscow, who is a lawyer. Thanks for joining me on The Voice of Russia.